Adam Kinzinger is a former Republican congressman. Welcome to our program, Congressman Kinzinger.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump will not abandon Ukraine, according to Bloomberg and Bloomberg sources in Europe. Meanwhile, Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, says that he would like to see the end of the war between Ukraine and Russia as good for Ukrainians as possible. What is your take on such statement, and do you see this publication and this statement as a sign of a major shift in Trump's stance on Ukraine?
Oh, man, I hope so. I don't think we know until we know. Look, I mean, the reality of it, if I'm just being honest, is I don't think Donald Trump really knows what he stands for. And so what you see is these people around him that are each coming up with their own interpretation. And we have to wait until Donald Trump gets into office to see what he gives. Now, more than likely, this is my belief, because Donald Trump really does not know this stuff. He's probably going to leave some of this up to the people that are dealing with this, whether it's going to be Marco Rubio or Pete Hegseth or whoever. And so I think you'll see whatever the plan is come together then. I mean, look, there's not a single person in this world except Vladimir Putin that does not want to see an end to this war. Nobody more than Ukraine. But we want to see an end in a way that doesn't lead to another war in 5 years. So I hope Donald Trump has made a major shift. What I do worry about is I don't think there's going to be much more aid coming from the United States, because I have a hard time seeing how the Republicans vote for that, which is unfortunately sad. Maybe I'm wrong.
Also, it is interesting that according to the latest publication on Financial Times, Trump's team would like Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. But how would it be possible to do so if the United States will not send military equipment to Ukraine?
Well, now here's where the possible good news could be, because I think there is a belief, and I agree with this belief, that if we negotiate. Now, personally, what I'd rather see is give Ukraine everything they need, take their land back, and then negotiate. However, if the negotiations begin now, I think there might be an understanding within this administration. I hope there might be an understanding that is going to have to come with continued U.S. supplying of arms to Ukraine. Now, I think what that could look like, instead of kind of aid, it could look like a contract where the United States, similar to what we did to Afghanistan, we give military equipment. Ukraine buys that military equipment as it's able to do, which I think Ukraine would want to do anyway. And I think the understanding is that we have to arm Ukraine and make it so that Russia does not consider reopening that war in the future. Because if you all of a sudden say, Ukraine, you don't get any weapons from the United States, there's no peacekeepers in Ukraine, there's nobody monitoring, the border between Russia and Ukraine, and by the way, you can't join NATO, then all of a sudden it's just a matter of time until Vladimir Putin rearms and re-engages in the war. And I think this administration understands that. So that's the good news.
You just mentioned some elements of the Kit Kellogg's plan on Ukraine. Do you believe that freezing the front lines and deploying peacekeeping forces and this all stuff from Kit Kellogg could work with Russia and could work with Ukraine? Do you personally believe in effectiveness of this plan?
Look, the only way, and again, I really am deferential to Ukrainians. I mean, you guys are the ones fighting this war. You get to make those decisions. So, I don't have any skin in the game, and I recognize that. My tendency is to believe that if we go from we'll freeze the current lines, if that is the starting point, then you have to start from that position with, if Ukraine gives up that land, obviously should never recognize those lands as Russian. That should always be recognized as occupied Ukrainian lands. But then Ukraine should have a military that, as it is today, is whatever it is, the 6th or 7th most powerful military in the world. It should stay that way. Secondarily, We should ensure that if there are no peacekeepers, American or European troops in there, that again, Ukraine has no restrictions on what it can do to defend itself. And I think those are the ways to start if you're going to freeze the current lines. And with that, you have to have a guarantee that Ukraine will eventually be in NATO. I mean, those are the only ways to guarantee that Russia doesn't reopen this war again. Otherwise, again, maybe, we'll see what ends up happening in terms of occupied Ukrainian lands. But you cannot start from a position of Ukraine gives up the land, because the idea that Ukraine has lost this war or is losing this war, and I hope your people hear this, is insane. Ukraine is winning this war. I mean, at this rate, with what Russia has taken of Ukrainian lands in the last 2 years, it would take over like 100 or 200 years for Russia to occupy Ukraine from 3 days, right? All a defending country has to do to win a war is to keep defending, and Ukraine's doing that brilliantly. So I think this negotiation should start from the position of not that Ukraine is losing and we have to negotiate, but Ukraine is actually winning this war. Now, how do we stop further bloodshed and further wars?
Retired General Ben Hodges also recently said that Russia today is in a more weak position rather than a year ago with the fall of Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. How can you assess Russia's position before the start of these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and how can you assess Vladimir Putin's position right now? Would he be more weaker in talks with Donald Trump, as they have lost their military presence in Syria and have sustained such unsustainable losses in Ukraine and also Kursk region of Russia? The Ukraine's offensive is going on there.
Look, if you're a believer in God like I am, you have to believe that these things that have happened in the last few months were like divinely, inspired to happen before negotiations. The loss of Syria, nobody saw coming. And then it happened really quickly. And I think that's what we're on the edge of with the Russian economy. This could be tomorrow. This could be in a year, maybe 2 years. But all indications are the Russian economy is a paper tiger. And it's sitting where the former Soviet Union was, as of today, where the former Soviet Union was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russia can't even take back its own land. It was invaded for the first time since World War II and hasn't been able to take that back. So Russia's a terribly weak country in a terribly weak position. I mean, if you think about the number of losses that the Russian military has had, I forget the number they started out with, but they've probably lost 70% of their original invading force. At the height of Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States had only committed something like 10 or 12% of our entire military to those wars. That Putin has committed his entire military. So, look, I think Ukraine can go in this very strongly. I think Russia's in a very weak position. And I think Vladimir Putin, in his mind, is just desperately hoping that something changes when Donald Trump becomes president. But if Donald Trump becomes president and signals that he's going to stand with Ukraine, I think I think Vladimir Putin will come hat in hand begging for an end to this war.
So if Donald Trump will support and stand behind Ukraine, do you feel that Vladimir Putin will not be able to properly sleep at night?
Correct. I mean, look, here's the reality. And I think Ukrainians know this more than anybody, but Russia's not going to win this war. The only way Russia could win this war is if the West abandons Ukraine, because the Ukrainian people, as sad as it is, the burden that you guys have to bear in this fight, you're willing to bear this burden to defend your country. I mean, who wouldn't be? My God, it's your country. This is what you were born in, what you grew up in. You're just asking that you have the tools. And I got to tell you, they used to think, when I was growing up as a kid, I always thought Soviet equipment and American, NATO equipment was the same. No, it's like this. NATO equipment crushes Russian equipment. And so the more that the Ukrainian military is being outfitted with NATO equipment, which is far more than it was even at the beginning of the full-scale war, the more lethal that the Ukrainian military becomes. You will not lose this war if the West continues to stand with you. And that's the other thing is, even if the United States pulls away, the Europeans have the ability, if they decide to equip Ukraine with everything Ukraine needs to win. But Europe has to wake up. And even 3 years after the start of the full-scale invasion, it seems like they're still rubbing their eyes in the morning and haven't had their coffee yet. They're not waking up to the real threat that Russia and China ultimately is.